Hey everybody, welcome to episode 1 of Rick and Jerry Talk About Life and Other Things. I'm Rick Alloway.
And I'm Jerry Renaud. Welcome.
We're glad you're joining us. This is our inaugural venture on this. We've gotten a few other interviews lined up in the past. We want to kind of replay, but it's sort of our, not only our first episode, but kind of a year-end wrap-up as well. And we thought it would be a good opportunity for us to just chat a little bit about the state of the relationship between the media and the public, which is somewhat tenuous and fractured at this moment.
I think that's a good way to put that. It's been sort of an interesting year in terms of what's been happening in the media. There have been some good things, I think, and there have also been some negative things and some things that have been reported that haven't ended up being true. And so we sort of have this interesting mishmash of people's thoughts about the media and what it's doing and what it's trying to do. And I think it's a good time to talk about the media as we are and have been part of the media, and we teach journalism here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We certainly have our thoughts in terms of the value of journalism and what it brings to the world and what it brings to communities, small and large. So I think it's a good time to sort of talk about that and encourage people to not be quite so judgmental and so quick to judge sometimes in the media.
And we will end up our inaugural podcast by replaying part of an interview that we did a few months ago with Holly Wise, who was on campus to talk about the movement towards solutions journalism. So we thought that was a good way to end up the year, and rather than just talking about what we don't like, maybe posting some opportunities to find some solutions. But certainly this year gave rise to some terms that have now entered the national lexicon, things like alternative facts and fake news. That troubles some of us who are trying to teach the next generation of young journalists to go out in the world.
Yes, maybe we're overly optimistic sometimes, but I don't believe that at least most journalists are out there with the idea and the concept that they are going to try to hurt somebody by the story that they are covering, or that they are trying to make up facts or create things that are not true, and that would be fake news. If people were out there and just deliberately trying to create an agenda or make things up or just out and out have no facts as a part of a story. And I just don't believe that most people are doing that. Yes, you can disagree with what a journalist is saying. You can be opposed to what he or she thinks are the facts in this particular instance. But to call it fake news, that really seems to insinuate that someone is out to get you or to get your organization or whatever it is that you support. And I just don't believe that is true in most instances.
Certainly, there have been incidents in the last month where there have been some, to be blunt, some spectacular fails by journalists who have gotten their facts wrong and have driven some, I think, unintentionally negative narratives that have had to be recalled and corrected. And that has certainly given ammunition to those folks who say, see, this is what we're talking about. This is the fake news. The difference, I think we would agree, is that when journalists get it wrong, I think we try to correct the record as quickly as possible. In the case of, for instance, Brian Ross, senior investigative journalist for ABC, he was suspended for a month with no pay, and they've told him he will not be covering the Trump administration again. That seemed to be a fairly immediate response to that. But that doesn't always make people feel better who feel that there's a deliberate attempt out there to try to shape the news.
Right. I think that in most people's line of work, whatever it is, there are mistakes that are made. I mean, that's just the human nature of things. We are all do things that we jump to a conclusion, or maybe we measured something differently and while it was being built, and so we had to tear it down and we had to redo it. I mean, there could be any number of things, or you make a grammatical error which sort of changes a sentence somewhere along the line. But in most instances, no one knows that. I mean, we're in our office, we make the mistake. Somebody is nice enough to come and point it out to us and say, well, you made a mistake here. And you go, oh, wow, I did. Thank you so much. But nobody is looking at it. Nobody is reading it. Nobody is being able to point at you and say, look, you made a mistake. Journalists put themselves out there on the line every day. And yes, there are times when people get a little overzealous and have information that they didn't corroborate like they should have, or checked for a second or a third source, which they didn't have, and they release that information, and it's wrong, and it's embarrassing, and you do have to walk it back. There is no question about that. But again, to insinuate that it was a deliberate effort, I think that's where I have some problems and some issues with that.
How much do you think, and I know we talk about this in our classes a lot, that the reduction in size of newsrooms, the elimination of middle management editor types to take another look at this, coupled with the sort of hyperspace jump to immediacy because of social media and everything, that those two sort of work against each other in the pursuit of a second or a third source and that elusive thing called the truth?
I think that is very prevalent. There are not the kinds of people in news organizations that will look at something a second or a third time to try to double check or to encourage people whether they have all their T's crossed and their I's dotted. And again, it is a world where we want things immediate. So it is always who can be first with this information rather than who can be right with this information. And I think it's very frustrating. And social media has done some wonderful things for us. We are both on social media. We like social media and think that it is really cool. But there are times that social media can be very negative and can be derogatory and can put forward information that is not true. And we sure hope that people are looking at it and taking it with a grain of salt in some instances, that they're not double checking to make sure that this is correct information and they're not just jumping to conclusions.
Yeah, the good news about the internet is everybody can be a publisher. The bad news about the internet is everybody can be a publisher.
That's right.
And that you really have to examine whose opinion this is that you're reading, particularly with the incredible growth in fake news sites that legitimately are fake news sites, yes, that appear to be legitimate news. And then you look at it and you go, oh, wait a minute, this isn't ABC News, this is abckindanews.com. And they hoped you didn't really catch that difference in the URL. And before you know it, I mean, I've gotten burned on this myself a couple of times, looking at these and going, sure, wow, I have to repost this, and then suddenly going, wait a minute, is this really legitimate? And I see all kinds of friends who post stuff that's not sourced properly, and then you add into that the deliberate attempt by apparently some actors from outside the borders of the country to try to roil the opinions of people prior to the last election, not necessarily to take a stand for a candidate one way or the other, but to at least get people fighting with each other. And now this, just within the last week or so here, we're seeing the social media networks making a much more concerted effort to take down some of the accounts of folks they think are out there perpetuating intentional and deliberate hate speech or inaccurate information.
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea. And you and I have had this conversation, and I actually use this example in class, and we've actually played this movie in a couple of our classes, but a number of years ago, and it's been quite a while now, Paul Newman, Sally Field were in a movie called Absence of Malice, where she is playing the part of a newspaper reporter, and they're having this conversation, and she says, well, all I want is the truth. And he said, look, truth isn't that easy to find. It is not that difficult. It might be something that you hear or something that somebody has told you, but what actually is the truth? And the example then that I use is you can take a set of facts that have been reported and about the economy, and two different economists can look at those set of facts and be able to extrapolate completely different views about what is going to be happening as a part of that. And so where is the truth in that? And I think we're seeing some of that at this particular point in time when we're talking about this new tax plan
Absolutely.
That's coming forward. So We hear lots of information on both sides. Well, it's going to do this, and somebody else is saying, well, it's going to do that. And so, where is the truth in all of that? It's difficult to find. And so, I guess what we encourage people to do is to say, don't just look at one source. Don't just say, oh well, such and such, who is a reporter that I like, says it's going to be this, so that has to be true. Well, that might be somebody's opinion or an economist's opinion, but somebody else might have a completely different view, and it might be, no, this is really going to be a good thing. It is going to stimulate the economy, and it's all going to be very positive. So we really encourage people to look at multiple sources out there to try to at least find out more information about something. Whether you actually find the truth is always a difficult challenge, though.
Yeah, I think the tax bill is a great example of this, because you can certainly find people on the very, very positive side of supply side economics saying
Absolutely.
this is going to turbocharge the economy,
Yeah.
and that money is going to trickle down to every sector, and you're going to have more money in your paycheck. And then you get other folks that say, we don't seem to find any history that says this works, and we've got people here that we think are going to be hurting, and this only affects a certain percentage of the population. And I can understand why a lot of folks find themselves scratching their heads going, well, which is it? I mean, it shouldn't be this hard to nail this down. But everybody's reality is rooted in just their own set of circumstances and their own situation, and that makes it really hard to find an omnibus decision that will please everybody in these kinds of settings.
Right, and you have to have at least some sort of trust in your elected officials that because we're all, I think, looking at the media side and also the politicians and people that work in government or whatever it is. They're all trying to do good things. They're all trying to help out the economy. They're trying to help people have more money, and it's just different viewpoints. And sometimes I think we get a little venomous in terms of how we react to some of those things. If it's not something that we specifically agree with, then we get mad and think that they're not telling us the truth. And again, where is the truth in all of that? So again, I just think we need to be a little bit more careful in terms of how we gather our information, how we look at it, and making sure that those sources of where we're getting that information do have some sort of credence in terms of the information that they're giving us.
But a real systemic concern with the whole fake news mantra is that this consistent drumbeat about fake news undermines the entire information superstructure of the world. That if you are convinced that no one is telling you the truth about anything, then how far does that extend? If the National Weather Service says, hey, we've got a blizzard warning coming in for tonight, you say, well, but that's a government agency, and I've been told not to trust government agencies, so I don't believe that. Because I keep hearing this fake news. Don't believe the experts. Don't believe they're paid by these folks, and they've all got their own agenda. This sets up at some point a level of paranoia about believing anything that I think is truly dangerous as a society.
Oh, absolutely. I think you and I would both agree that we are here in Nebraska. We think the media in Nebraska do a great job of covering the local communities, and that is really a key element. You have all kinds of small weekly newspapers that are covering things that are happening in that community, and both the good things and the bad things. And you have radio stations across the state and television stations who spend a majority of their time looking at local issues and community issues and trying to keep people informed as to what's happening with ag prices or what's happening with the weather or what's happening with education or the kinds of things that are really going to impact their lives. And if we continue to put out there that all media are bad and it's all fake news, it worries me that we would perhaps lose some of those entities, and I think the communities would lose as well.
Well, and full disclosure, a lot of those operations, print and broadcast, are operated by people we've worked with,
Yes.
students that have come through our program or fellow alums of this institution that were in our class. And I think when you know some of those people personally and you know that they are invested in the local communities in which they work, they live there too, they have to go back to work every day in those same communities, that they're trying to do the best they can to sort through things. But it can be a tough job, particularly I think when you're a general assignment reporter and every day you're getting assigned a story that you probably know little to nothing about, and you're expected to get that story done in one day's time and come up to speed on it and understand all the nuance. There was a reporter from a TV station in Denver who earlier this week had posted he'd gotten a story wrong, and rather than just correct it, he went through and did actually a video piece on the anatomy of the error and how he got it wrong, and was reading a statute that was very convoluted, as a lot of legal statutes have to be to cover all of the bases, and it missed a phrase, it missed a clause when he was reading it, admittedly hurriedly, and had to come back and correct that and say, you know what, I just missed this phrase, but thank you to those people who caught it and let me know that this is why this happened the way it did, and we've corrected the record, but I want you to know this is how our business works too, and we do occasionally get in a hurry. It's the way we live our lives. So since we're going to be talking about solutions journalism here pretty quickly, let's you've mentioned a couple, but let's try to put forth some solutions to our listeners here about how to best find solutions in a world where there's a lot of fake news being bandied about, whether or not it is or not.
Yeah, I think it's great that people care enough to tell people and tell reporters when they think something is wrong. I think that's important, and I think most reporters, I mean, nobody wants to hear that they made a mistake or they did something wrong, but I think that everybody would like to be able to correct it, and it doesn't have to be in this terribly venomous way that we tend to want to report this now, and instead of going to the reporter and say, look, this isn't really the way that it happens, you need to look at this and this and this, and you make a very good point that in most instances, reporters do not have a week to be able to go out and really study this information. They're trying to do the best they can, usually in a few hours, to try to understand this story, figure out the best way to tell it to the audience and put it out there. And so sometimes not all of that information is there. I got an email from somebody the other day saying, I watched this story on the news, and why didn't they talk to the engineer? Why didn't they do this? Why didn't they do that? And I tried to explain that you don't know that they didn't try to call the engineer, but maybe the engineer was the city engineer was busy that day,
right.
And so they were unable to do that. So who did they find? Well, they found the people in the community that were very concerned about this situation, which was putting a stoplight in on a street somewhere where kids cross the street to go to a school. So I tried to explain what the process was of how they probably went about doing this story, and he wrote back and very nicely and said, okay, I understand better. I didn't really know that. So talk to the reporters, tell them what if there is a problem or what your side is, and see if they can correct it, see if they'll do another story and give your side of it. So I think that we ought to, again, be diligent in this, but how we do it is not to go out and put it on Facebook and Twitter or whatever your social media element is and say, this person was wrong, and make them look bad and call it fake news, but let's figure out a way to correct it. I think that's important.
Right. And I think the absence of a particular source or particular viewpoint in the story, as you make note, is not an indication that there was no attempt to get that side of the story. But particularly when a story has to be turned around within a news outlet in a matter of hours, getting sources to return calls to you during that time frame can be tough. Someone may be out of the office for the day at a conference or just not able to return calls until after your deadline had come and gone. There are instances where somebody looks at that and says, I'm not calling this guy back. This is going to be a story I don't want to be any part of.
Right.
So you never know the reason why somebody didn't return a call. I do think in that case it's good for a reporter to say or to write, attempts to get in contact with this person were not, the call was not returned or the message was not returned or whatever, just so they know, okay, you did your due diligence and you did at least reach out to this person to try to get that side of the story.
Right.
And it is tough. I think the civility angle of it, of saying, look, I don't think you did a very good job of this. How can we learn from this, is good. And I think it ties to, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole too far here and keep people from getting to our interview with Holly. They can always just skip ahead through this portion of this rambling.
Fast forward.
But you and I are asked frequently, as are some of our other journalism colleagues, why we're not more opinionated in our social media. And at least in my own case, and you and I have had this discussion before, I just don't think that's what we're here for in that public venue. We certainly have political opinions and social opinions, but we are in a situation where we were raised to from the standpoint in our formative years of getting into this business that journalists were not about their opinions. Journalists were about trying to get all sides of an angle
Right.
and pursue the truth. And what our opinions were didn't really matter unless we were doing an op-ed piece, which is kind of what this is, but we're still not going to issue too many of our own political opinions here.
No, no, and part of the reason for that also is that you and I have known each other for a long time, and we don't always agree on everything, but it's hard, I think, to define either one side or the other. I know very few people who say that they're conservative that are conservative in all of their views,
Right.
or people that say that they're liberal, that maybe they're liberal on a social side, but maybe they're very conservative from an economic perspective. So I think putting these labels on people doesn't help us at all. And you and I do not want to be labeled
No.
one way or the other, because we do have differing views on whatever the subject matter ends up being.
Well, and it's important that what we're teaching our students is process and not a specific viewpoint on things.
Absolutely.
When we've taught our intro courses, I know one thing I always tell the intro class that I teach is to say, look, I don't care what your viewpoint is. I care that you have a viewpoint, but that I want to make sure that you don't single source your opinions and
Right.
your viewpoints on things. That if you want to listen to a particular commentator or read a particular op-ed piece, by all means do as many of them as you can. But to say I only get my news from one newspaper or one radio program or talk show host or one television cable news channel, that's dangerous, because we are becoming more and more tick the box kinds of things with some of those national outlets in particular. And I don't think we're quite as much with that with local media. I think local media, because they do live in those communities and see those same people every day at the gas station and the coffee shop and the grocery store, that there's more of an opinion of let's try to get all sides covered and really do the best we can for the local community.
Right. I think our hope always is, look, we need to work together, and we need to find solutions to the problems that we have, and that's one of the things that is really important and valuable with journalism, and I think one of the things that journalism can do to really be helpful within communities.
And to speak to that, earlier this year we spoke with Holly Weiss, who was on the campus to talk about a national movement called Solutions Journalism that was responding to criticism that all journalists do is stir things up and then walk away from a problem. And her organization, which is made up of a number of very well-seasoned journalists from a variety of different outlets, was designed to try to help solve issues rather than just bring attention to them. And here's that interview that we had earlier this year with Holly Weiss. Welcome. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Define for us, if you would, since many of our folks listening may not have heard that term before, how are you defining solutions journalism, and how is it distinct from the general day-to-day reporting folks are used to reading, seeing, and hearing?
Yeah. So at the Solutions Journalism Network, we have a working definition of solutions journalism, being that it is the rigorous reporting and critical analysis of how communities are responding to social problems, and also providing that same critical analysis to the results and the effectiveness of those solutions.
Okay. When what you have had a long history as a working journalist yourself, at what point did you say to yourself, there's another step we need to take here, or was that just innate? You had that from the start?
I did have it from the start. I was inspired to pursue journalism when I went to Romania when I was 18. And so when I went into J school, I definitely knew that I wanted to use my storytelling skill sets to hopefully incite some sort of positive change within society and within my coverage areas. And so even though at that time I wasn't aware that solutions journalism was a term, I still approached my stories very much from a solutions-oriented framework, and wanted to provide my coverage area with information and the necessary tools that they would need to implement change within their community.
Maybe we can talk about some specific stories and how you think that they sort of fit into the solutions journalism part of things. Because we have lots of obviously journalists as listeners. So maybe some specifics might sort of help people along in terms of
Yes,
what this really is about. And then, of course, I want to ask you about, does this work with the elections?
It's on my list too.
Oh,
so
good.
we'll get to
Okay.
it.
So when we look at a story example, I can use one from a personal reporting experience that I had last year. I took a team of students to Baltimore right after Freddie Gray was killed and shortly after the riots had happened in Baltimore. And so we went and we spent a lot of time in these communities and in these neighborhoods. And one thing that we noticed was that organizations and some churches had gone in and built community gardens in empty plots of land. But what we saw was that the signs were torn down and the gardens were overgrown, and you could tell that no one had been tending them for a long time. And so we did some digging around and some reporting, and through the course of our news gathering, we discovered that the organizations, even though they were well intended, they went in and they started the garden, but they didn't communicate to the neighborhood or to the community that the garden was for them. And they also didn't teach them how to plant things or how to cook the food that was harvested or anything like that. And so we started then asking our sources, well, if a community garden is such a need to solve the food desert problem within these communities, then who's doing it better? And is there someone who is doing it better? And that's a key function of solutions journalism, is to ask our sources, as journalists, to ask our sources who is doing it better and how. Because that can lead to the effectiveness of solutions within a community. So we asked that question, who's doing it better? And as it turns out, there was another organization in a different neighborhood who was doing it better. And their model was that they went out and they recruited women in the neighborhood to come in, and on a rotating schedule, they would water, they would plant. They taught them classes on how to garden and how to use the food that they harvested. And so when we wrote the story, we wrote it with that solutions framework. Certainly we talked about the problem of food deserts within these communities in Baltimore. And then we looked at the solution, kind of exhibit A, the solution that failed, the one that didn't work, and why. And then we looked at the solution that was working and how they had had success with that. So that's one just a personal example from my reporting experience of how we did that.
Is there a follow-up to that? I mean, do you sort of go, okay, we've now presented a solution, but where do you go back and say, okay, what happened? Did our solution really end with somebody doing something about this?
Right. So I think that as journalists, we can sometimes be very good at that initial story, but it's the follow-up stories that we sometimes fall off on. And with solutions journalism, it is important and it's incumbent upon us, I believe, to come back and to revisit these solutions and to check in and say, okay, what does the data say? What is the evidence? Does the evidence support the hypothesis that this solution worked? Or is the evidence there that says that it failed? And we have to be willing and able to report both sides of that. And so, yes, and I think that that's where our reporting can also hold people accountable as well to the solutions that they're trying to bring about in their community, is to come back and do those follow-up stories.
Because that assessment piece also then helps deflect any charges that people who are into solutions journalism are practicing advocacy journalism and taking a specific viewpoint.
Exactly. And there's a big distinction, between advocacy journalism and solutions journalism. And as objective storytellers, we are not saying this solution is the solution that everyone in the world should adopt. And we're also not saying that this is the best solution or that it's even the solution that we think is going to be most effective or that we think is going to work. We are simply reporting on the data and the evidence to support the validity and the viability of that solution.
To Jerry's question earlier, you want to talk about the elections? 'Cause I think that was a key one on mine as well.
Yeah, maybe I have just one quick question because I find it fascinating these days with what's happening in journalism, and you talk about advocacy stories and objective journalists. Do we have objective journalists? Do we have objective journalism that's really taking place? I mean, I think in some cases we do. I think it's really taking place more in smaller newspapers or smaller radio stations or television stations that are doing those kinds of things. But sort of on a national scale, it seems like it is not what it used to be.
No, I would definitely agree with you. And I think that with a lot of the reporting that I personally do and the reporting, the social justice reporting that I think solutions journalism lends itself to, I tell my students that there are certain topics that I just want to be on the right side of history on. And for me, in my reporting, that certainly means flirting with that line, of objectivity, but also maintaining the understanding that I am a journalist and that my job is to report the story and to be as fair and balanced as possible. But I would definitely agree with you that objectivity is definitely lacking.
Because there are certainly some stories where there is truth on one side or the other. And for us to just say, because I know that for Jerry and myself in broadcast journalism, we get a lot of criticism that it's, to quote Jon Stewart, 5 minutes of screaming on the left followed by 5 minutes of screaming on the right. And we go, we got to leave it there. And that there are stories where there is no counterbalancing argument.
Correct. I absolutely agree.
Okay.
Thank you for saying that too.
Well, it's what we firmly believe as well.
Yes.
I mean, there is absolute truth on some stories.
Yes.
And so for us to just say, well, but other sides say, no, there isn't another side on some of them, or at least not an equal other side. So.
No, but sometimes the truth is hard to find.
Of course it is.
And that's a difficult scenario, and so we're thankful that there are journalists that are out there that are looking at some of those kinds of things.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, let's talk about the election. I think the election is an interesting place to talk about solutions journalism. Do you see any of that really happening and taking place as far as the election is concerned, or upcoming election?
That's a student asked me that yesterday as well, and how we would approach election coverage from a solutions mindset. And I'm a little bit wary just because I personally haven't seen much in the way of solutions journalism mindset being applied to election coverage, and I think that would be a challenge to bring it there. With solutions journalism, I can definitely see pieces where you could approach a story from a solutions mindset, perhaps with second day stories after an event or after a speech or policy announcement or whatever might be the news of the day. So I think that you definitely could, but I also think that it would take a lot more creativity to develop that story than perhaps what a lot of journalists today have time for, unfortunately.
And that leads me right into my next question, which was, given the reduction in sizes of staffs over the years, the number of just the smaller number of working reporters today than there might have been 10 years ago, need solutions journalism be time and labor intensive, or are there ways to pull this off without a journalist saying, to go back to Jerry's question, I'd love to follow up on this, but I've got my next 5 assignments here and I'm pulling double duty because the guy next to me didn't get replaced. How do we continue to devote the labor to this that sounds like it might require?
Yeah, so with solutions-focused stories, they do require a lot of analysis work and collecting data, and in many cases being willing to be kind of the feet on the ground in a lot of these situations, which we should be anyway. But they do require a lot of time, and they require a lot of collaboration, usually among a team. But what we have found is that editors are tending to be willing to allow their reporters time to work on these kinds of stories. And we have seen that with our newsroom partnerships that we've established within the professional journalism side of the network. And so that's encouraging that the editors are willing to grant the reporters the time to do that. And then there's also a significant amount of interest and desire for journalists to produce these kinds of stories. And I think in large part because we see as a result of studies that readers become more engaged when they read a solutions-oriented piece than when they're faced with a problems-focused story. And so reporters can certainly make the argument to their editors that these stories will increase reader engagement and audience participation and impact and create bigger impact within their community.
But there is value in some of those other stories as well. Would you not agree?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
And you talked about in the tool, the toolkit, at the sort of the story that takes place right at the end of the television newscast, which is let's all feel good about these kinds of things. And there's some value to those stories as well.
Yes, yeah, there certainly is value to them, and typically what we see with larger investigative pieces. You'll have a series, and what a lot of reporters are choosing to do is to include a solutions-focused story as the closing story of that investigative
The close the loop
series.
story.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
See, I like that because I think that, to your point, Jerry, I think that helps buffer journalists and the journalism community from the complaints we often hear that you guys are so negative. It's just all downer stories. And if you're able to say, look, we are exposing some pretty ugly truths here, but here's how we think we can bring this back full circle and make this into a positive entity, I think that creates a better image of the media.
Yes, I agree. I think that it elicits hope within an audience, and I would certainly aspire that some of these stories would also incite positive action within a community where people are motivated to go and implement this change or try a model or introduce a policy or a piece of legislature that would affect some kind of change. Like I think that's very important.
We've been referencing the toolkit you've heard us talking about in the last few minutes. It's a 48-page guide produced by the Solutions Journalism Network. And one of the things I liked about it was you're encouraging people very actively to jump in and sort of do a wiki version of add to this, help us do this. But I noticed you said specifically you were looking for more help with broadcast journalism. What is it about television specifically you referenced that makes this more of a challenge or that's causing it to lag behind?
So I think one of the challenges that we face is teaching people how to bring the analysis portion of it that it takes to tell a solutions focused piece and how to translate that into a visual element or into a multimedia broadcast story. And so that has been challenging. On our website, solutionsjournalism.org, we have what we're calling the story tracker. And in the story tracker, we have tagged more than 1,500 stories that have been produced all around the world in different news organizations and entities, including broadcast. And so you can see how other people are implementing solutions journalism. But I think one of the challenges is that there aren't a lot of examples yet of really good solutions framed stories in broadcast yet for us to draw from. But we're working on developing some training so that we can get those journalists up to speed on that.
Rick mentioned earlier that the problem in some instances is smaller staffs. Broadcasting is certainly facing that same kind of a scenario. And not only are the staff smaller, but in a lot of instances they're being asked to do more. So you have to do more with social media. You have to put something on the web page. So where is journalism going? I mean, where do you see the future of journalism at that point? I think it's an interesting challenge for all of us these days to sort of think about what should we teach the students? What kind of skills should we give them? I mean,
that is a really big question.
If you have an answer,
stay tuned next week.
Yeah. She'll be back.
That's right.
So I think that at the end of the day, this is what my goal is for my students who I teach at Texas State University. I want them to know how to tell a compelling story in a fair and balanced and accurate way. The platform on which we deliver that story might change. It's changing all the time. It will change. Yeah. It will change. It's changing every day. But I think that if our students can be fluid enough to navigate those platforms, and if they can have the foundational technological skills to navigate those platforms, they can take those storytelling skill sets and apply them to whatever platform is the platform of the day. And they can also do that by being nimble enough to adopt things like solutions journalism when it fits into their story or into their piece. The age that we are in right now in terms of digital media and how people are consuming news it's very exciting, and I try to get students enthused about the power that we have as being storytellers, and just get them excited about being part of that process of helping us define the future of journalism and the future of news.
Do you find it problematic that sometimes the technology drives the information rather than the other way around?
Yes, yeah, certainly. Yeah, certainly. And that's why I think that, again, training students to know what is a good story and how to tell the stories that need to be told, which often are ones that are not being told. They'll be able to do that, and they'll be able to follow their instincts no matter what platform they're working with.
Yeah, and I would add that I think we need to train current journalists
absolutely.
as well as the students in some of those areas.
Well, since we're talking platforms, what is the role, in your mind, of social media in solutions journalism, where you're giving journalistic stories in 140 character bites? How do we make social media work?
So I think, I mean, again, with that, it really depends on the social media platform that we're working with, because we have to understand our audience and where our audience is. The audience that I have on Facebook is typically not the same audience that I have on Twitter, and it's certainly not the same audience that I might have on platforms like Snapchat or Purple or things like that. So I think that first is key to establish which audience is functioning on which platform, and then leveraging that audience to really engage with the content and to become agents of the story, if you will, in terms of sharing and distributing that content to their friends and within their networks. I am not a fan of just copying and pasting, the lead of the story into a Facebook post. That is not effective. Good. And I also don't believe that the goal should always be to have people come back to your website either. I think that sometimes we should just present the news to them in the place that they are, and sometimes that is their Facebook news feed or Twitter feed.
Yep.
So I think we have to be very clear then about who our audience is and where they are, and what our end goal is when we're presenting the news to them, and being honest with them about that. If we do want them to click on the link to go to the website, then be honest about that and transparent.
So the goal of the Solutions Journalism Network is what? What's your, when you sit down at night and go, this is really where I want this project to go, what are your hopes and dreams?
So I am one very small piece of the Solutions Journalism Network. It was founded in 2013 by Tina Rosenberg, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, and David Bornstein. And together they are reporters for the New York Times, and they write a column called The Fixes, where they examine a solution that's happening. It can be a global issue. And Courtney Martin as well is one of the co-founders. And so what we're working for is we provide a lot of training for professional journalists, and we're extending the network of newsrooms that we're in. So we do a lot of workshops in newsrooms, training professional journalists to think of their stories through a solutions framework. And we also have collaborated on reporting projects as well. So we are working on multiple reporting projects. We've done ones with the Seattle Times, and we're working on one right now with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune. And then the journalism school piece that's a new piece to this puzzle that I joined the team in February to begin looking at how we can introduce students to solutions journalism and get them thinking in terms of a solutions framework before they begin their journalistic career. So we want to continue that work on both the newsroom front and the university front as well.
You've been listening to an interview we recorded earlier this year with Holly Weiss, and that will pretty much serve as our wrap-up for this year, our first and last podcast of 2017. But we think it's a good start.
Yes, a good start.
Too big a word for December.
Right. So we think we're going to have lots of really interesting guests in 2018, and it may be from the world of sports, it may be from the world of education, it may be from the world of religion. Who knows? We want to talk about life. We find it interesting and fascinating in all forms and all facets, and we're looking forward to having those conversations, and we're looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Absolutely. We're looking forward to your feedback as well, because as media content producers, it is all about connecting with what you want to know. And if you think we've gotten something wrong, we want to know about that as well. We'll always keep it civil, and we'll ask that you do the same. The contact information will be here on this page. And so until next time, I'm Rick Alloway.
And I'm Jerry Renaud.
And you've been listening to Rick and Jerry talk about life and other things.